So the sun is gone. I turned on the light. I gave up. This is part 2 of the wrap-up from last week. I have a few more books to take care of, and the last video was already like 30 minutes before editing. So I thought I'd split it up, and I might start doing this on the regular. Like do a midweek Wednesday, Thursday thing, and then a Sunday one as well, so that hopefully I can do like, you know, shorter videos. But we'll see. There might be weeks where it's not needed, and I can fit everything in one as well. But not this week. The next book that I read was Stand on Zanzibar by John Brunner. This was published in '68, I believe, originally, and it is the same time as 2001: A Space Odyssey, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. So that's pretty interesting. It's sort of part of, I would say, like proto-cyberpunk stuff. So this book is interesting because it has the format of the New York trilogy, which means that, or the USA trilogy, I should say, in which there are multiple different ways of conveying information to the actual consumer or reader. There is context, in which you could think of yourself as like fly on the wall person walking down a street, looking at billboards, being inundated with content the way that you would be in any city, basically. So it looks the same, it's presented as the same content, but up at the top you'll see that it delineates the content. The happening world is literally what it sounds like. It is like slices of news, things that are happening in the world. Then it is tracking with close-ups, which, if I remember correctly, is basically, think of them as bit parts, where we're kind of seeing the side characters have mini arcs and doing certain things elsewhere. And then we have the actual meat of the story, which is the continuity. So it all looks the same. So you have to know what is going on, and there is an index at the beginning of the book to help you out. I saw some reviewers say they didn't figure out what was going on. If you don't see the start of the chapter, the top left corner, if you don't look there for what kind of chapter it is, it probably would be a little bit unsettling. But I've seen different modes of this already, so it wasn't novel for me. A lot of people seem to be very impressed and preoccupied with this kind of setting or structure for conveying world building. For me, I think I prefer the more modern way of doing it, where it's inbuilt to what the character is actually experiencing, but it definitely didn't hamper the experience for me either. The structure is definitely the most interesting part of this. There is a preoccupation with like an AI sort of technology. There is a character who gets inbuilt or ingrained and makes his way up into a corporate mega corporation, I guess you could say, that starts buying and ruling an actual country. And then there's like how would I describe this other guy? He's more of like a CIA type of guy who's like sleuthing around these types of situations. And we don't really know how they intersect until later, of course. So, like I said, though, the main draw here is, at least for most people, and myself included, not the actual plot. It is more to do with seeing the speculative nature of the work and how hit and miss it is, which is mostly hit. There's a fair amount of predictive stuff that is definitely uncanny in this. The rise of the corporatocracy, mega corporations, fascism in the government, anti-intellectualism. It hits on like 12 or 13 different topics very well. However, it does make the plot fairly forgettable, at least for me. Like, I've only read it a few days ago, and that's the only thing I took away from this book, is that the speculative qualities was very interesting. However, we're through the point that it is predicting, which was 2010. So it's more of like an interesting thing to pick up if you are merely interested in that particular aspect. I wouldn't say it is got like a modern classic quality to it, because it is so hyper specific to what it is trying to predict and what it did predict, than a sort of like overall massive thematic thing that comes to fruition, like say 1984. It was a 4-star read for me. I did like the prose quite a bit, but it is hit and miss. It's uneven. It's definitely better than Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, that's for sure, prose-wise. It has very interesting things to say. It's very dark, in the same way as proto-cyberpunk. It's showing the absolute depth of humanity living in sort of like the gutter, the poor versus the rich, and the accentuation of the stratification of class. Some things are very unsettling. There's, you know, rape, domestic abuse, in some of the context or tracking shots and all this stuff. So it's like, it's very much being inundated with content and then seeing the speculative qualities. But otherwise, I would say it's fairly forgettable. Next, I read Sterling Karat Gold by Isabel Wadner. This was fantastic. I gave it 4 stars, and it was close to 5 stars as well. This book is another decolonizing project. Wadner is pretty explicit in their views about using fiction as a way of progressing what they're studying, which is intersections of queer, brown, and black bodies being violently erased and hurt by state, and vicariously white people that have been like systematically and institutionally indoctrinated with this kind of stuff. So white supremacy, basically. Absurdism and surrealism to make like a phantasmagorical fiction is what I think of it as. The premise, as far as you can kind of tell because there's some heavy surrealism happening, is Sterling is a non-binary person, and on the way back from a game, they're assaulted by people. And immediately the surrealism makes it so that Sterling interpreted as a bullfight, which is really evocative just in itself, because he sees these people as matadors who are lancing him or lancing them and striking their neck and like, yeah, essentially engaging in a ritualistic, violent act against them. And another person named Rodney intervenes, and the rest of the book is the fallout of that, where these white supremacist dudes attempt to take Sterling to court because they fight back and they're harmed. And they try to offer a different story, of course, to the court. But it becomes very much like tied to queer art and a queer reading of art for what the surrealistic properties of things are. So Sterling's interpretation of the world is very like steeped in certain imagery from paintings that are all mentioned in the back of the book. There's like different references, and then it's queer readings of those things to mirror a commentary on the actual institutional systemic things that are happening. It is also like a queer reading of like UFO culture in a specific like speech, I guess, from Eliza Muhammad, I think, it did a speech on a cultish thing of white supremacy and UFOs, and that's been like sort of co-opted into the narrative, and it's just really fun. It's actually funny. I laughed out loud multiple times, which never happens basically, and it's just so thoughtful about the themes and pretty hard hitting while still managing to, you know, play on this absurdism and surrealistic qualities. It's wildly excellent, I think. The only reason it didn't get a 5 from me is towards the end. I think it becomes very difficult to follow what is happening, and that made it less impactful from the times when I could do a one-to-one with the concrete details of what is happening and the extrapolation. as you continue on, at least for me, because I'm not from the UK and this is very much a UK book, it might have been referencing certain cultural things that I wasn't understanding and different like historical things that I definitely wasn't understanding to use as touchstones instead of concrete details. And so towards the end, I was kind of just along for the ride rather than like critically engage, which I think is the point of this book to some degree, and just enjoying it and kind of wishing that that quality had extended to the end of it. But fantastic read. The next book is The Candy House with Jennifer Egan. This book, if you remember last week, I read The Goon Squad to prepare and I gave it 5 stars. It was completely excellent. This book, I'm sorry to say, does not live up to The Goon Squad in any manner, I think. There's 2 chapters that I thought worked quite well in this book, whereas others did not. It purports to be about performativism and authenticity being examined or interrogated with a new technology in which people can externalize their memories into a general intellect unit or a general consciousness, cultural consciousness, something like that is what it's called. There's a device that is invented and it alternates between these characters that are tied to the characters in the Goon Squad. I don't think any of the ones in this with a specific frame is from the Goon Squad, but they're all interconnected. It actually would have been very helpful to have like a relationship or arm map for the chapters, because there's the daughters, there's some kind of like convoluted connections that are happening in the book. But the main issue that I have with it is that in the Goon Squad, Egan is very good at her characterization and her specificity and her diction. It all goes towards a clearly loving, well-rendered, empathetic view towards absolutely every character. Generally, if you think of, say, Donna Tartt as having like a character revolving around a secret that they never tell anybody, these characters, not in this one particularly, but in the Goon Squad, all have quirks or foibles or flaws in which they revolve around. And it does a fantastic job of humanizing them. Like, I think it's actually a humanist piece of work, Goon Squad is, and this is completely antithetical to that because it is very preoccupied with trying to accomplish the specific goal of the authenticity versus the technology introduced, that is the central component rather than the characters. And the characters are completely left by the wayside for the most part. There's a kind of skating quality to the prose in which she clearly doesn't care about the granularity of them. She is trying to make a specific point and tries to arrive at that point in a way that the flows of the prose are excellent. No problems there, but you don't really have a sense of a well-rendered character. They're not nuanced whatsoever. Sometimes they have the quirks that you can kind of like expect from the Goon Squad, but otherwise they exist sometimes solely, in the case of Hannah, for instance, a lawyer that appears in a later chapter one time, to kind of feed into this complexity web of all of these people are interrelated in a certain way and have been affected by the technology, although that is not actually something that's proven by the book, in my opinion. It keeps vacillating between the technology and the authenticity, but in such a way that it ultimately doesn't say anything substantive about it. It tries to by verbalizing it through dialogue in a couple of characters, but if you look at the actual thematic work and what actually happens in each story, it absolutely doesn't. Like, maybe 3 or 4 chapters it accomplishes that, and that's it. It also tries to be unconventional with formatting in some of them, just like in Goon Squad, there is the PowerPoint presentation that was amazing. In this, Lulu, the daughter of a marketing expert that appears in the Goon Squad, is revisited, and I really liked that component of the book because Lulu essentially suffers some trauma in the first book, and then we never touch on her again. In this, we see what that trauma has wrought, except that in so doing, she becomes the embodiment of that trauma. She's not an actual person that expresses anything or we see anything of other than that trauma. And while it is interesting that it is centered, it ends up decentering her, ironically, because she doesn't feel like an actual fully rendered person. Only the fact that Egan was clearly hung up on the trauma and wanted to revisit it. So I didn't like that. Similarly, Lincoln's chapter, the boy with autism and charts in Goon Squad, was a very effective chapter. Now he's much older, and he's in a workplace of typicals and atypical neuro-minded people, neurodivergent or typical. And there's this weird us versus them quality to the chapter that I didn't like. The overall thematic work I thought was good, and yet his chapter becomes a point of plot in which another character can extract something transactional from him, which leads to the networking email chain chapter that I absolutely was bored and hated, and just sort of felt mean-spirited. It once again made every character just about transactional natures that didn't fully render them. The dialogue wasn't very convincing, and it was boring to actually consume. And it was, again, them trying to get the band together sort of circuitously because Lulu needed to contact somebody else and sort of work something out for her. So whereas Sasha was the main character, the point of focus, the epicenter of the Goon Squad, Lulu is of this. But where Sasha is fully rendered and it shows how much her life impacted everyone, Lulu's life, like I said, is boiled down simply to a few plot points, and I absolutely hated that about it. Coupled with one story that was absolutely fantastic, 100% 5 out of 5, the Cuckoo chapter, in which the twin girls of Lou from the first book contextualize their entire childhood from living with their mother and living with their father. It actually made the rest of the book feel bad to me, because she showed on display that she had all of that empathy, the really excellent writing, the just like pure empathy for these characters, and then leaves them by the wayside right after it. And the previous chapter is Lincoln, so it was sort of like getting a little bit better and then kind of worse, because Lincoln is reduced to his neurodivergent qualities to it, and it kind of made it feel freakish to him. Like at first I was thinking, is this fetishizing neurodivergent people? And I thought not, but I was reading this as a buddy read with Mark Nash, and he was the one that said it does feel like more like it's trying to form an in-group, out-group, and say that his particular expressions and the way that he interacted with other people was freakish in a way, either to laugh at him rather than with him, or the ways in which he goes about what he wants, and the way that everybody who isn't typical communicates rather than it being on a spectrum. So yeah, I didn't like it. I gave it 2 stars. Next, I consumed on audio Redefining Realness, My Path to Womanhood, Identity and Love by Janet Mock. I gave this 4 stars. It was an excellent memoir. It chronicles from an early age her wanting and feeling like a trans person, but not having the literature, the knowledge, or being in a family that is aware of it or accepting of it, and having an abuser target the vulnerability that she displayed in clearly wanting to be at least feminine, very different. I don't think she initially articulated that she knew she was specifically trans, but she always did want to identify with girlhood in some way and womanhood. And then as she grew up, it transitioned into her knowing that she wanted to be a woman. and she did exactly what she needed to do in order to do that. She was a sex worker. She worked like 2 other jobs. She went to school. She basically kept her whole family kind of like afloat. Her mother wasn't able to support her. Her brother wasn't able to support her. She had, I think, only one support system with a friend that was going through something similar. So she had quite the life until things were realized. And everything about it I thought was quite good. It would have been a 5-star read, except that she gets very puritanical about sex workers in a very strange way. I wouldn't be surprised if she has some like internalized trauma from working those jobs, because she did go through some stuff. But she essentially articulates many times that she thinks no girl or woman, no female person should ever have to work a job like that ever, even people that choose to do it. So it's strange in that way, maybe some internalized like Catholicism or something, I don't know. But there's some big judgments on sex workers that was strange and at odds with the love and kindness and everything else in the book. So that put me off for that time, but otherwise does everything a memoir should, and yeah, it was fantastic. Next, I consumed Mouth to Mouth by Antoine Wilson, again on audiobook. Gave this 4 stars. I saw this on Sean the Book Maniac's channel. This is about a man that doesn't have very much means saving a man of means, though he doesn't know that at the time. A body essentially washes up on the shore. It's a person who's obviously drowning, a man, and he saves the life. The paramedics take him away and separate them though, and there's some protocols in place where he's not allowed to meet the guy or know the guy, but he circumnavigates this, finds out he's rich, owns a gallery, inserts the guys into his life in a very disingenuous manner. And what we come to realize is the story is more about interrogating the ways in which transactional relationships occur, around like how when anybody ostensibly is given a specific opportunity, that is the point at which their character is tested, and the ways in which motivated thinking allow for people to do some pretty questionable, horrible things, justify it, and how it completely alters their trajectory of life and who they thought they were, what they thought they would do. And it was a fascinating, very short read. I think it was like a 5-hour audiobook. And yeah, it is an unreliable narrator who is continually trying to articulate how much he feels bad about things he continually does. He keeps crossing boundaries. And it's very interesting that his justification for that comes from the transactional nature of saving the man's life, despite the fact that that man that he saved becomes very clear that he is a horrible person. So it's very interesting character study of, I would say, both men, but also capitalism, and yeah, like I said, the transactional nature of which we approach absolutely every aspect of our lives. And then lastly, I read The Shining by Stephen King. I'm not going to say too much about this. I think everybody knows what it's about. A family goes to live in a haunted hotel where the caretaker starts becoming like plagued by visions, essentially. He's an alcoholic. He's an abusive personality. He's got internalized trauma cycle, and he has been violent with his son once before, and he's been violent with a student before. He was a professor or a teacher of some kind and laid hands on a boy who, I can't remember, did something. He was a prick in some way. And so it just becomes a really interesting, nuanced look at basically you could think of it as a nuanced character study on Jack, the father, specifically, around anger, around the trauma cycle that is very nuanced and has very like intricate symbolic mentions and iconography and evocative simile use and stuff like that throughout the book. It was very fantastic and creepy. And then coupled with that, I would say I guess you could say the B plot is the son who has the shining and is like ostensibly like a psychic type person in this universe who has precognition and has foreseen that things will go poorly in the haunted hotel. So it's sort of about the loss of agency and the reclaiming of agency in a boy that has this gift, as well as the character study work. I would say, again, the mother has not too much of a role, just like in the movie, but she's far more, has more scene time, she has more dialogue than in the movie, so I like that quite a bit. Everything was fairly like complex, I would say. Like, I wasn't expecting that. I thought it would be more like commercial fiction, to be honest, because the guy puts out a lot of volume. It's written in 77, yet still very relevant. I think it's sort of a universal commentary on toxic masculinity, on sort of intergenerational trauma. I always think it's like bizarre that there's a lot of white people that resist the idea of intergenerational trauma when like there's generations of alcoholics and people that beat their children and stuff like that. Like it seems very intuitive that if you're consuming any kind of media whatsoever, that people pass it down these things generationally, and this is very much about struggling against a cyclical thing that is coming for you and absolutely looking to drive your life. So yeah, it was just great. I will kind of was thinking that I might even read the second one, even though this one was very creepy. I couldn't read it before bed or stuff like that, because he's very good, like I said, with evocative similes where it's like just really unsettling, creepy juxtaposing of things in a lexicon that is like got a very tight ecosystem of words. So yeah, it was phenomenal, I have to say. The only reason I didn't give it a 5 stars is because there's this very strange chunk of the book that is larger than I think I expected it to be, in which the black cook, I believe it is, has a section in which, well, I think explaining it would give it away, but essentially when there are portions of the narrative that focus on this man, there is some very strange perception that is happening, like the framing of his actual scenes and the omniscience of the third person narration bleed together in such a way as to characterize some of the hypocrisy, the racism, the prejudice that he suffers as being articulated from his own mind, which doesn't seem to be the case when he's verbalizing it and when it's clearly delineated in his own thoughts. There's a lot of use of the N-word, and there's a lot of like every interaction essentially that he has with another person is colored by his racial attitudes in it, which I'm sure was progressive for 77 at the time, but it feels definitely antiquated and a little bit mishandled because it sort of insinuates that the black man is calling himself the N-word quite a few times, when it doesn't seem like he has any internalized notion or self-hate about that. So I think it was a just mishandling of how that prose work was actually articulated. And then I was probably just more keen to it as well because I was listening to it on audiobook from a white person saying it as well. So I was kind of like, this is weird, and paid more attention to those sections to see if it was done justice or not, probably because it was a thing that draws your focus when you're listening to audio. So I gave it 4 stars when it could have easily been a 5-star book. And that's the end of the wrap-up. If you've read any of these books, I'd love to know what you thought about them. If you have thoughts about my thoughts, if you have feelings, if you have anything you want to articulate at all, put it in the comments, and we'll have a little chat. I'll see you next time. Bye.